In 1897, Basil Negrich arrived in Canada with his wife Anna and their 7 children. They made their way here to Manitoba and eventually bought the property here north of Gilbert Plains. They lived here for the rest of their lives and in fact had 5 more children, bringing their total family to 12 kids, 6 boys and 6 girls, and initially at least, they all lived happily in one house built in 1899. It's still here, and this site is widely regarded as one of the best preserved and most complete pioneer homesteads anywhere in Canada. I'm Gordon Goldsborough, president of the Manitoba Historical Society, radio and newspaper columnist, and author of books on the neglected, the overlooked, the hidden places from Manitoba's past. Join me in this series as we explore back roads to places that tell great stories about how things used to be and how we've ended up where we are today. This is Abandoned Manitoba. The thing that's so impressive about this site is that all of the buildings are original and in their original spots. You know, that's really rare. It's almost like time travel. It's almost like we've been magically transformed back to 1899. It is that impressive. Arriving in western Manitoba, Basil Negrich acquired a quarter section of land, 160 acres north of Gilbert Plains. At first, the family lived in a temporary shelter called a Buddha, made of locally cut poplar logs covered in cowhide. Over the next several years, they cleared areas in the surrounding forest to make fields for growing crops, and they constructed other log buildings, a livestock barn, a pig pen, a chicken coop, and several granaries. By 1899, they had completed construction of a fine farmhouse in a style reminiscent of ones in the Carpathian Mountains of their Ukrainian homeland. This house was built in the traditional way of Ukraine. It had 3 rooms, a small room, a sort of a medium-sized room, and a larger room. We're in the center room, which is the middle room, and this is the kitchen. This is where they would have made the meals for the entire family. A wood-burning stove to cook the food, a table probably to make bread and other foods, a little bit of storage. They had a little shelving unit here. They had a cream separator to separate the milk that they were getting from their livestock, but the majority of the food would be stored in one of 2 places. Either it would be below our floor. They would have had a root cellar where they would have kept things that were perishable, things like potatoes and turnips and things like that. Or they would have kept them in the smallest of the 3 rooms through here, which is the pantry. Just to watch the low door here. In the pantry, we have storage, things like an ice chest where you can keep some of the perishables. You have shelving where you have the dishes and pots, probably also some of your foods. You keep some of your dry goods in your crocks and your jars over here. And in this case, you perhaps even have your library where you'd keep your books for everybody to keep themselves busy in the wintertime. This is the family room. This is where the family would spend most of their time. Imagine 14 people in this room. 2 parents, 12 children. 6 boys, 6 girls. Now, in time, they got a little bit crowded in here, and they actually built another building called the bunkhouse nearby, and that's where the boys would stay. But mom and dad and the 6 daughters would somehow find space in here. Perhaps in one bed would be mom and dad and a couple of the daughters. The other bed, maybe the other 4 daughters. But then in the morning, when it was time to get ready for the day, they'd put all that away, and this would become the living space. It's a place where you would meet to have your meals. Maybe you would have lessons if you were having classes here at home. In the evenings, you would entertain yourself. You might have board games. Maybe you'd read. Maybe you'd play. You'd perform, with a violin or some other musical instrument. Basil Negrich passed away in 1927, and his beloved wife Anna died in 1944. The youngest of their 6 daughters, Annie, continued to live in the original farmhouse into her 80s. The building had no electricity. Lighting came from kerosene lamps, and heat was provided by firewood. There was no running water other than what flowed in the nearby drifting river. In 1968, Annie Negrich was joined by her brother Stephen, a retired schoolteacher, and the two siblings spent the rest of their lives together, living off the grid, pretty much as their ancestors had done for generations, until Stephen moved to Dauphin in 1990. One of the remarkable things about this house is that it's essentially built in the same way that the Negrychs would have built their house in their homeland in Ukraine. They would start with a solid foundation of field stones, and on top of that they would build a stack of logs. And we can see them over here on the edge. There's just simply locally cut tamarack logs. In a few cases, when they were especially large, they might use an axe to sort of square them off so they would stack more easily. And they would notch them at the end. You can kind of see that here at the corner. This one sits in a little trough cut out of the one that goes the opposite direction. So they just alternate them back and forth as they go up, and you get this nice tall stack of logs that makes a wall. The only problem is there are gaps between them. You can see them here. And of course, that wouldn't be so good in the wintertime. The wind would blow right through. So you got to do something to kind of give you a nice sealed wall. The secret then is mud plaster. This stuff was made locally. It had 4 ingredients. It had clay, which provided sort of the adhesive force to kind of hold it all together. It had straw, and in fact, you can see the bits of straw here. That's the fibrous material that kind of held it together so that it wouldn't just fall off again. It had water so that it made it viscous so you could spread it until it dried. But the secret ingredient was fresh cow manure. Fresh cow manure has fibers, again, to hold it together, but it also has enzymes that help harden it. And so when it's finished, when this thing all is dry, it's a nice solid exterior that keeps out those chilly winter winds. While exploring the Negrich homestead, I bump into the site staff working to maintain the buildings using traditional methods. So how long does it take to do a wall like this?
This took me about half an hour so far. To do the whole building will probably take me about a day.
Oh, so this is a long-term project.
Yes.
So the idea then is that take a bit of mud, smear it into the cracks, lo and behold, an airtight wall. So this is the bunkhouse. It was built in 1908 as the house nearby started to get a little crowded. You know, with all those 12 kids, there just wasn't room for everybody. So they moved the boys out here. Imagine 6 strapping lads crammed into this small building. And of course, in the wintertime, it might get a little chilly too. So lucky for them, they have this. This is a peach, and it was a very common feature of some of the early Ukrainian settlers' homes. The idea was that it really served 3 functions. One, of course, was to radiate heat and would keep this room warm. The idea, they would light a fire inside, they'd let the embers kind of glow down, and then they would take loaves of bread that were unbaked and slide them inside. Of course, the heat would be held by the wood, by the clay of the peach, and they could then bake the bread. So you get heat, you get baked bread, and then the third function is that, of course, the smoke that would be coming out of the peach would rise up and out. There's an awning on the outside of the bunkhouse, and it would collect all that smoke, and there they could hang things like hams to smoke them, to cure them, for preserving them for long periods of time. So 3 basic functions served by the peach here. Basil Negrich was joined in Canada by 3 of his brothers, and the 4 Negrychs bought adjoining property. I've been told that buildings that belong to some of the brothers are still standing nearby, so I set out to find them. I find that 2 other farmyards are within a short walk of Basil's farmhouse. But, having been neglected for what looks like many decades, their condition is poor. Well, like the other house, this one has the same basic layout. It has a central room right off the main door, which probably would have been the kitchen. They would have had a wood stove in here for making the meals. On the other side of the kitchen is a larger room that would have probably been the family room. They would have had the beds and the table and the places where they would have spent much of their day. The difference, however, is that on this side of the kitchen, where the other house had a pantry to kind of keep things cool, instead here we've got a rather larger room that includes a peach. Now the peach in the other house was actually in a separate building, and of course the idea was that the heat that it would give off would be useful to keep the boys that were living there warm. Well, this obviously then means that this room wasn't used for keeping things cool. What's interesting in this case too is that we can see how the peaches were made. This one is not nearly as well maintained, and so we can see, for example, that it's made out of wood. Seems a little unusual that you would make a structure to burn wood out of wood, but of course the reality is they covered it in a very thick coating of clay, and the clay basically makes it fireproof. We're in a small cemetery northwest of the original Negrich homestead. It's called Kolomaya, but its informal name is the Negrich Cemetery because so many members of the Negrich clan are buried here. So behind me are the graves of Basil and Annie Negrich, the original patriarch and matriarch of the family, and around them are various members of their family. Over here are the graves of Stephen and Annie Negrich, their children, who lived at their homestead right up until the 1990s. You know, they really illustrate the difficulties that settlers arriving in Canada overcame to make a better life for their children. The Negrychs have thrived in Canada, and their descendants are spread all around the world. But in a very real sense, the homestead and this little cemetery tell us the story of that original family experience, arriving in Canada to make a better life for themselves.